Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. Whoops, one device didn't get turned on. Okay, let's try that again. Hello everyone, welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Vav. We're continuing to learn halachos sukkah. We'll be learning today Mirz Hashem Daf Pei Zayin Amid Aleph, but we begin on Pei Vav Amid Beis with the new Siman Taf Reish Chav Zayin in Dine Hayoshein Basukah, the halachos that pertain to one who sleeps in a sukkah. And as we're going to see, it's a little bit interesting to me the way the Mechaber titled this Siman, because the halachos that we're going to learn in this Siman do not pertain only to one who sleeps in a sukkah. It really pertains to all of the living in a sukkah that we do over Yom Tov, whether it's eating in the sukkah or anything else, etc. So it is interesting to me that the Mechaber titled it the halachos of one who sleeps in the sukkah, but nevertheless, that is the words that he wrote. Ubay dalet seifim, and here we have 4 seifim. Says the Mechaber in Sif Aleph, the Ramah puts in a few words here of Hakdama. The Ramah says, Tzarech leishev ba'avir hasukkah. One should understand that in order to be yotzer the mitzvah of sukkah, you have to be eating, sleeping, whatever it is, you have to be in the sukkah. You have to be sitting in the airspace and the tsail, the shadow of the sukkah, the shelter of the sukkah, as opposed to being in the shelter of something else while you are in the sukkah. So let's take a look right away at Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Aleph, where the Chavetz Chaim makes this point, and he explains why the Ramah put these words in here. Hikdim bazeh, we have this little hakdama over here, says the Chavetz Chaim, kedei leida hatam b'yoshein tachas hamita delo yotza. The very first halacha the Mechaber is going to discuss with us is somebody who's sleeping in a sukkah, but he's sleeping underneath a bed in the sukkah. And we're going to see that depending on the construction and size of the bed, etc., he may not be yotzer the mitzvah. He might not be sleeping in a sukkah because he's actually sleeping in the shelter of a different shelter while he is in the sukkah. So in order for us to understand where we're coming from in this siman, the Ramah begins with this hakdama to let us know why it is that if you sleep under a bed, you might not be yotzer. She'ena yoshein b'tseil hasukkah, because if you're sleeping underneath a bed or inside some other kind of structure inside the sukkah, then eina yoshein b'tseil hasukkah, you're not sleeping in the shelter of the sukkah, ela b'tseil oihel. Rather, you're sleeping in the shelter of a different shelter. You're not in the shelter of the sukkah, you're in a different shelter. Now let's go back to the Mechaber. Says the Mechaber, Hayoshein tachas hamita basukah. If somebody sleeps underneath a bed in the sukkah. So now it depends. Is he considered to be in the shelter of the sukkah, or is he considered to be in the shelter of the bed? Well, that's going to depend on the nature and the size of the bed, the space underneath the bed. Does it meet the requirements necessary for it to be considered its own independent shelter? So says the Mechaber, Imhi gavaya asara tvachim, if the height underneath the bed is 10 tvachim, so that the bed is sheltering above an area of 10 tvachim, says the Mechaber, lo yotza, now you're not yotza the mitzvah of sukkah, because when you're sleeping underneath that bed, are you in the shelter of the sukkah? No, you're in an independent shelter. You're in the shelter of the bed. Let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah Katan Beis. First, the Chavetz Chaim makes the point, Hayoshein. The Mechaber speaks here of somebody who's sleeping underneath a bed. Says the Chavetz Chaim, the Ikar Yeshivas HaSukkah, the main point, I guess, of living in a sukkah, hu achila, shtia, v'shena. When we speak about leaving our diras kva and moving out to a sukkah, moving out to diras aroi, so we're supposed to be living in a diras aroi for 7 days, what does it mean to live in the sukkah, to live in the diras aroi? So the ikar of living, the ikar of dira, is achila, eating, shtia, drinking, and shena, sleeping. And that's why the Mechaber discusses here hayoshein, tachas hamita, somebody who sleeps underneath the bed. Now, you may ask me, okay, so why didn't the Mechaber just say ha'oichel tachas hamita? Why do we have to discuss somebody who sleeps under the bed? And I think the answer to that is that it would be very unusual for somebody to be sitting and eating underneath the bed. for somebody to be sleeping underneath the bed would not be so unusual. It takes more space to sleep than it does to eat. So if you think about a sukkah that's not very large, and you have different people trying to cram into a smallish sukkah, if the sukkah is high enough and you could stick a mattress under the sukkah, there you go. You have a very convenient bunk bed. Somebody could sleep underneath and somebody could sleep on top. So it's less unusual to be sleeping under the bed than it is to eat under the bed. Ice cotton gimel. So the Mechaber said this fellow is sleeping underneath the bed. Is he yotza or not? So the Mechaber said it depends. If the area underneath the bed is 10 tfachim high, then he's not yotza. Says the Mishnah Ice cotton gimel. Gavaya asar tfachim min haaretz ad tachtis hamita gavaya asara tfachim. If from the ground until the underside of the bed, this person is sleeping underneath the bed. So if from the ground till the underside of the bed above him is 10 tfachim, then he's not yotza. Why isn't he yotza? Explains the Chavetz Chaim. Since the bed is sheltering above an area that's 10 tfachim high, chashiv ka'ayel. An area that's 10 tfachim high is a makom chashuv, and something that shelters above such an area is considered to be its own independent shelter. Umafsik bein hasukkah. So now, this person who's living underneath the bed, he's in its own oil. He's in an independent oil. He's in the shelter of the bed that's above his head. Now, it's true that this shelter is within another shelter. But so what? He's not being sheltered by the sukkah. He's not living in the tzeil of the sukkah. He's living in the tzeil of the mita. And that's not a kosher sukkah. It's puzzle. Continues the Chavetz Chaim. Va'afilu dafnais hamita kitzarim ma'oid. Even if the walls of the bed are very, very narrow. Kitzarim over here means narrow. She'ein lehem afilu roichav tefach. So that they're not even 1 tefach wide. Still, this area is still considered to be underneath the oil of the mita. Now, when the Mishnah Berurah discusses over here the walls of the bed, right? Even if the walls of the bed are kitzarim, what's he referring to? So, let's say this is your bed. Now, bed is generally, right, it's supported by legs. Now, if the legs have a significant width to them, so then you could see those legs as being walls, as being defanois of the area that's underneath the bed. But if the legs of the bed are just slender little sticks, then essentially this oil underneath the bed has no walls. Now, we're discussing over here somebody who's sleeping under the bed, and we're saying that if the bed is sheltering over an airspace of 10 tfachim, then it's considered its own independent oil, and now this person is not yotza because he's in the oil of the mita, not in the oil of the sukkah. What the Chavetz Chaim wants to bavarin over here is, you might have thought that for the underside of the bed to be considered its own independent oil, maybe it's not enough for it to have a gag, it's not enough for that space to have a roof, maybe it has to have defanois, it also has to have walls. Comes the Chavetz Chaim to tell you, no, it does not have to have walls. As long as the bed is above, and you have an airspace of 10 tfachim, even though there are no significant walls over here at all, the legs of the bed are just narrow little posts. Still in all, it's considered that he's in an independent oil, and he's not yotza the mitzvah of sukkah. Now in Sharet Zion's cotton dalid, the Mishnah Berurah, the Chavetz Chaim, felt it necessary to tell you where he got this from. So he's pulling this from a Rambam. The Rambam in Perek Hey from Hilchos Sukkah, Halacha Chav Gimel, he writes over there, V'chein hamaymid arba kundosin. If somebody, forget sleeping under a bed, somebody puts up one of these little foldable gazebos inside the sukkah. So he just has 4 poles, 4 little narrow poles, upara sadin alehen, and he spreads out a sheet on top of the 4 poles. So over there the Rambam says, im gevoyin yud tfachim, if those poles are 4 tfachim high, so that underneath the sheet there's an airspace of 10 tfachim, harei zek sukkah b'sayich sukkah, you will now have essentially a shelter within the sukkah. And since this is piras ala sadin, since you just put a sheet on top of those 4 poles, it's not kosher eschach, and therefore the person living underneath that sheet, sleeping underneath that sheet, would not be yotze the mitzvah. Now over there, clearly the Rambam is discussing a case where there are no walls. He says, Maimin Arba Kundasin. The person only put up 4 poles and spread a sheet above them. So too over here, even if the legs of the bed are very narrow, so the airspace under the bed has no defanos, has no walls at all, still in all, it's its own independent shelter, and the person underneath it is not Yoitza the mitzvah. Okay. So in this siman, we're going to see that the Mechaber is going to go mikal ala kaved. He's going to go from simpler cases to more complex cases. So here in Sif Aleph, we had a very simple case. A person was underneath a mita. He was underneath a bed. The bed is forming a roof over his head. Said the Mechaber, okay, if it's 10 tefachim tall, he's in an independent oil, and he's not Yotzei the mitzvah. Now we go to Sif Beis. Hayoshein takas hakila basukkah. What if somebody is sleeping underneath a kila? What's a kila? Let's take a look at Mishnah Berurah's Katan Daled. Takas hakila. Heim sadinim, these are sheets. Haprusim svivais hamita, that are spread out surrounding a bed. Al arba kundasin, on 4 poles. Vahamita be'emtsa'a, and the bed is located within these sheets. So, what the Chavetz Chaim is discussing over here, and the case that the Mechaber is discussing, is you have a bed. Now, you surrounded the bed with a canopy. However, the canopy is not attached to the bed in any way, shape, or form. You've got a bed, and around the bed you put up 4 posts. And maybe you put up sheets around this area. So not only is this area going to be covered over, it's also going to be sheltered on the side, maybe for privacy. So you have sheets around the bed, and you put a sheet over the top. Okay, what's the case? What's the halacha now? Says the Mechaber, Hayoshein tachas hakila b'sukkah. If somebody sleeps inside this kila within the sukkah, now it depends. If inside you don't have a height of 10 tvachim, or if you don't have a roof that's a tefach wide, in either one of these cases, yotza, you are yotza. So the Mechaber is telling me over here that in this case of the kila is a little bit different than the case of the mita. In the case of the kila, he says here, there are 2 requirements that we need in order for it to be problematic. One is that the airspace underneath the kila has to be 10 tefachim wide. That's similar to what we learned at Sif Aleph. In order for this to be considered a chashava oil, in order for it to be considered that you are sleeping in an independent shelter within the sukkah, you have to have a height of 10 tefachim. If you don't have a height of 10 tefachim, you're yoitza. Now there's another thing. You have to have a gag rachav tefach. You have to have a roof that's at least 1 tefach wide. So if your sheet on top is flat, so that the width of the roof is at least 1 tefach, then it could be considered its own independent shelter. But if the sheets go up like a teepee, I guess, if they go up at a slant, and at the top you do not have a width of a tefach, then it's not considered that you have a gag. If you don't have a gag, if you don't have a roof, then we can't say that you're living in an independent shelter. So to sum up over here right now, so far what the Mechaber has said, you're inside this canopy, inside the sukkah. So if you're missing one of these requirements, if you're missing either one of these requirements, if either it's not 10 tefachim tall, or you don't have a gag of a tefach, you don't have a roof that's at least 1 tefach wide, then you're yoitza. In order for this kila to be problematic, in order for it to be considered an independent shelter, you need both factors. You need that it should have an airspace of 10 tefachim, and you should have a gag, you should have a roof that's at least a tefach. Says the Mishnah Berurah in Ois Katan Hey, Emeina Gavaya Asar Tfachim, Eina Chashav Oil B'ftei Atzmai. If you don't have airspace of at least 10 Tfachim tall, it cannot be considered an independent shelter. And here, the Chavetz Chaim tells us a very important point. Asar Tfachim, in this case of the Kila, how do we measure the 10 Tfachim? When we spoke about the person who was sleeping underneath the mita, sleeping underneath the bed, we said you measure the 10 tfachim from the ground until the underside of the bed. How do you measure over here? V'asar tfachim, again, moidedin me'ara, we measure the 10 tfachim from the ground. In the first case, in Sif Aleph, the person was sleeping on the ground underneath a bed. And we said that it's only problematic if there's an airspace of 10 tfachim. Where do you measure the 10 tfachim? Well, he's sleeping on the ground. You measure the 10 tfachim from the ground to the underside of the bed that's above his head. Over here, we have somebody who's sleeping on a bed, and the bed is beneath the kila. Now, you might have thought, maybe I should measure the 10 tfachim from the surface of the bed that he's sleeping on to the underside of the canopy above him. Says the Chavetz Chaim, no. In this case, you measure from the ground until the underside of the kila above his head, not from the surface of the bed that he's sleeping on. Why is this? The reason is because this kila, when I described the kila to you, I told you that the kila is on the ground. The posts that hold up the canopy, they're not attached to the bed. They're on the ground surrounding the area that the bed is in. So we look at the kila as being independent of the bed that's beneath it. We don't look at it that the kila is sheltering over the bed. If we looked at the kila as sheltering over the bed, we would say that you have to have an airspace of 10 tfachim from the surface of the bed to the underside of the kila. But we look at it as the kila is sheltering over the ground. In that area, you put in a bed. But the bed is independent of the kila, and the kila is independent of the bed. So we measure from the ground that the posts are resting on to the underside of the kila. Now let's go to Ois Katan Vav. The second requirement over here is that you have to have a roof that's at least a tefach wide. Ois Katan Vav, ois she'ein lo gag tefach. Okay, so before we get into the complicated case of the Chavetz Chaim, let's just make sure we have the basics over here. You have the bed is surrounded and is roofed over by this kila. The Mechaber taught us that in order for this to be considered an independent oil and to be mafsik between the person and the sukkah, you need two requirements. You need an airspace of 10 tfachim, and you have to have a roof that's at least a tefach wide. Now the Mishnah Berurah is going to go into a little bit of a conversation of this requirement that you have to have a roof that's a tefach wide. First, I really should have prepared this. Let me see if I could make a little ad hoc, some walls of a sukkah over here. Okay. Normally, you've got the walls of the kila, and you would have a roof above. If you have a nice long flat roof, so you have a tefach wide. Let's say you have instead, you have like this, what I called before a teepee. If you have a teepee, so now you do not have a gag of a tefach. You don't have a roof that's a tefach wide. If the walls would go up at a slant, but they would be more like this, so that they don't meet at the top, but they're a little bit apart. Trying to get the right angle over here with the camera. I don't know why it's giving me such a hard time. If it would be like this at the top, so that even though the walls are sloped, but you do have a roof of a tefach wide, then already it's considered a gag. Now the reason why you need a gag tefach is because if you just have slanted walls, then there is no gag. When you just have slanted walls like this, so in halacha we look at it that you have walls, but you don't have a gag. If you don't have a gag, if you don't have a roof, then we cannot consider it an oil chashuv that's mafsik between you and the sukkah. So you have to have a gag. So again, the Mechaber made it very simple. The Mechaber said you have to have a gag tefach. You have to have like this with a roof on top. If you don't have a gag tefach, if you have it like this, then it's not an oil chashuv mafsik, and then you have no problem. Now, the Chavetz Chaim is going to give us some other cases. Ayin b'Magen Avram, he tells us, take a look at the Magen Avram. Ta'afilu ba'oifen zeh. Even in this case, where you don't have a gag tefach, and you would think, okay, I'm good. I learned the Mechaber. I don't have a gag tefach. I go like this all the way up to a point at the top, and I don't have a gag tefach, so I should be good. Says the Chavetz Chaim, not so fast. He says, take a look at the Magen Avram. Im yesh bepachos mishloisha tvachim samach lagag roichav tefach, if within 3 tvachim of the point at the top you hit a width of a tefach, dahainu, what's that? What does that mean? La'achar sheyarda min aksala mikanu mikan. When you go down from the point and you start to slope down on each side, min akloinis, from the pole that makes the top. What the Chavetz Chaim is figuring is like this. How did you erect this teepee? You have over here, it meets a point at the top. What's supporting it at the top? What's supporting it at the top is a pole. That's the kleinus. The kleinus is a pole that the 2 sides go on. So the Chavetz Chaim says, if when you come down the slope on either side from the pole, if you come down less than 3 tvachim, and at that point you have a width of a tefach, ein sham min tefach zeh, after you slope down from the pole on each side, v'nisrachavu tefach, you hit a width of a tefach, ein sham min tefach zeh ad akloin shloisha tvachim, and from that point where you reach, I wish I had something to rest this on. Let me see. I got to get height so that you can see it on the camera. Okay. You've got like this. Now, let's say if at this point where my ruler is, you have a width of a tefach, and from there until the top, it's less than 3 tvachim. Okay? So that's the case that the Mishnah Berurah is describing over here from the Magen Avraham. You come down from the slope, you come down from this kleinus, from this pole that's supporting the sloped side walls. You come down, and over here where the ruler is, you already have a width of a tefach, and from there to the top is less than 3 tvachim. That, the Magen Avraham says, creates a problem. Im ein sham min tefach zeh, if at this point in the height where the width reaches a tefach, ala kloin shloisha tvachim, you have less than 3 tvachim from that point until the peak. Aser liishain tachtav, you're not allowed to sleep or eat underneath that roof. Why? Lefisha kol pachas min shloisha tvachim u kalavud. We have the halacha l'Moshe b'Sinai of lavud. What does lavud tell us? Lavud says that anything that's within 3 tvachim is considered closed. Ukeilu yesh begaga roichav tefach v'yedei zeh shuv nikra b'shem oil. What the Magen Avraham is saying is very simple. Well, I mean, I guess it's simple. If you understand it, it's simple. If you have, again, I need my tissue box over here to give me height. I don't know why the camera is like confounding me. If you have, let me get my ruler again. So where the ruler is, you have a tefach of width. Now at the peak, you don't have a tefach of width. But down here, you do have a tefach of width. And that's within 3 tvachim of the peak. Well, then Lavud says that from above the ruler until the peak is considered closed off. Well, if all that is considered closed off, well, that means that in essence you do have a gag of a tefach. And since you have a gag of a tefach, also lishen tachtav, you're not allowed to eat or sleep underneath it because you're not in the sukkah. Oid kasvu b'shem ha'aguda. Now we also have another interesting case brought down in the name of the Aguda. Let's go back to the Mechaber's simple case. You reach a peak at the top, and at the peak you do not have a width of a tefach. And we won't throw in the Magen Avraham's complication. Even if you go down 3 tvachim, you still don't have a width of a tefach. So now you would say, okay, now I'm totally good. I don't have a roichav tefach at the peak. I also don't have a roichav tefach within the top 3 tvachim. So I don't have a lavud problem. So I'm good. Says the Aguda, not so fast. Einoi mutter, this is not considered a kosher sukkah, rak kishahasadinim magiem la'aretz. Only if the sheets that make the side walls go all the way down to the ground. De'im yesh aver hefsik beinom la'aretz, afilu rak kishir tefach, aser. But if your sheets, if your sloped walls do not extend all the way down to the ground. But instead of going all the way down to the ground, you see what kind of trouble I'm having here with the camera? It's because somehow everything is mirror imaged. So every time I'm moving in the wrong direction. And somehow it's just totally confounding me. Guess my brain is not used to working backwards. So, if the side sloped walls don't make it all the way down to the ground, but instead of making it all the way down to the ground, they're raised above the ground, at least a tefach, then you have a problem. Why do you have a problem? Now, the Chofetz Chaim over here in the Mishnah Berurah doesn't spell it out, but in Sharetzion Katan Ches he does, and I'll tell you first what he says just outside. Again, I pointed out to you in the beginning of this Mishnah Berurah, why is it that you have to have a gag roichav tefach? Because in order for this shelter to be considered an independent shelter, it has to have a gag, it has to have a roof. But if you reach a peak, if you reach a point at the top, if you don't have a roichav tefach at the top, then it's not considered that you have a gag. All you have is you have defanois, you have walls, but you have no gag. And without a gag, it cannot be considered an oil. Since it's not an oil, you could sleep under it, you could eat under it, you're still considered to be in the tail of the sukkah, not in the tail of an independent oil. However, that's only true, says the Aguda, if the sloped walls go all the way down to the ground. If they go down to the ground, then you have the ground beneath, and you have sloped walls on each side, but you have no roof. So you don't have an oil mafsik. But let's say the sloped walls do not go down to the ground. They're above the ground. They're raised above the ground. Now, you see that space between the bottom of the sloped wall and the ground? Well, if it's less than 3 tefachim tall, we say limud. Oh, in that case, that space is closed. And what's it closed with? It's closed with a straight wall. So if it's right, because limud says that you go from the base of the sloped wall down in a straight line. Limud doesn't go at angles. Limud is not going to say that it continues the slope. Limud is going to say we go straight down from there to the ground. Oh, in that case, now you have a wall. That space that's closed because of limud is now a wall. If that's a wall, then the sloped wall is not a wall. It's a roof. The only time the sloped wall is considered a wall is if it's sloped all the way from the ground to the peak. So if your sloped wall is sloped from the ground until the peak, and you don't have a gag on top that's roichav tefach, so okay, you don't have a gag. You don't have a gag, you're not an oil. But if there's something at the bottom that we could consider a wall, then that's the doifen, and then the sloped wall is no longer a wall, now it's a gag. And now you do have a gag. Now that you have a gag, it's an oil mafsik, bein oil lebein aschach, and you're not sitting in a kosher sukkah. We can see this inside. Hatam. The reason it's a problem if the sloped walls don't reach the ground is now we go from the bottom of the sheet that's making the sloped wall down to the ground using lavud. And as long as you have a space there of between 1 tefach and 3 tvachim, so 1 tefach is already chashav a wall. That's already considered a mechitza. So if that's a wall, then the sloped sheets are now a gag. Umemela nasa hakila kegag. Now the sloped sheets are a roof. They have oil, and now you have an oil chashav. But if the sloped sheets go all the way down to the ground on a slope, then the entire sloped sheet is a doifen, it's a wall, it's a mechitza, and then you have no roof, then there's no roof here at all, and then it can't be an oil chashiv. But again, even this would only be a problem if between the bottom of the sloped wall and the ground you have a space that's between 1 tefach and 3 tvachim. If it's more than 3 tvachim, you can't say lavud. If it's less than a tefach, then even if we say lavud and close it up, it's not a mokum chashiv. It's less than a tefach. It can't be considered a mechitza. So then it doesn't become a doifen, and then the sloped wall is still a doifen. Okay, very, very interesting Mishnah Berurah, this one. Now we go on to Siv Gimel, where we have a more complicated case. So far we discussed over here a person who sleeps under a mita and somebody who sleeps under a kila. and the kila was independent from the bed. The kila is an area that's surrounded, it's got 4 posts, it's got a roof on top, maybe it's got sheets around it, but it's not attached to the bed. And in the case of the kila, we said that in order for the kila to be problematic, you need 2 requirements. One is that the airspace underneath the kila has to be 10 tvachim. It has to be a mokum chashiv in order for this shelter of the kila to be considered an oil chashiv. And you need a gag. So you need a gag rochav tefach. If you're missing either one of those things, if either you don't have an airspace of 10 tvachim or you don't have a gag rochav tefach, if you're missing either one, then it's not considered an independent shelter. And if you're underneath that kila in the sukkah, it's considered that you're still in the sukkah. Now let's tweak the case a little bit over here in Siv Gimel. Ha'etzim ha'yotzim me'arba roshei hamita. Let's say you have a 4-poster bed. So now you have 4 posts going up above the bed that are actually attached to the bed. Asar lifrais aleihen sadin. You're not allowed to spread a canopy, spread a sheet above those 4 posts. V'lishain tachtav, and sleep under it. Afilu im enam gevayim asara. And this you're not allowed to do even if you do not have an airspace of 10 tvachim. Now, before we even go to the Mishnah Berurah, beautiful Mishnah Berurah, but before we even go to the Mishnah Berurah, let's explain this. So, previously we said that in order for an oil to be considered an oil chashiv that's mafsik, in order for it to be an independent shelter, you need an airspace of 10 tvachim. Suddenly over here we're saying you don't need an airspace of 10 tvachim. What happened? What changed between the two? So the Mishnah Berurah is going to tell us that the difference is that when you have a 4-poster bed, so the posts that are supporting the canopy are fixed in place on the bed, that is what the Mishnah Berurah calls kavua ma'oid. That is very, very fixed in place. What do I mean is very, very fixed in place? That canopy is always affixed to this bed. The 4 posts are part of the bed. So when you put a sheet above those 4 posts, you're making an oil over the bed that's very kavua. It's very, very fixed in place. Says the Chavetz Chaim, and he's getting this from the Gemara, since this is considered kavua ma'oid, since this is considered very kavua, now you don't need both requirements of sif beis in order for this oil to be problematic. We had 2 requirements. One is you need a gag roich of tefach, you need a roof that's at least a tefach wide, and you need an airspace of 10 tefachim. In this case, you have a gag roich of tefach, because if you have a bed and it's got 4 posts, 1 at each corner, and you're spreading a sheet over it, it's definitely going to be at least a tefach wide. So gag roich of tefach you have, but you might not have gavaya asar tvachim, depending on the height of the posts. After all, you're only sleeping on this, you're not standing on the bed, so how much height do you need already? So you might not have asar tvachim. Still in all, says the Mechaber, in this case where it's kavua ma'oid, you don't need both requirements for it to be problematic, you only need one. And since you automatically have gag roich of tefach, even if you don't have gavaya asar tvachim, it's considered an oil mafsik, and you cannot sleep on that bed within the sukkah. We can see this inside in the Mishnah Berurah in the beginning of Siv Zayin, of Ois Katan Zayin. So we're going to start Ois Katan Zayin, but I'm not going to read the whole Ois Katan Zayin until we go further in the Mechaber and see the next case of the Mechaber. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Ois Katan Zayin, Ha'etzim ha'yotzim, Zehu mikri ba'mishnah kinoifos. In the Lashon of the Mishnah, this is referred to as kinoifos. Vahu kavua me'oid, and this is very kavua. This is an oil kavua, and I believe the reason it's kavua is because it's firmly attached to the bed. Wherever the bed goes, the canopy goes with it. Al kain, therefore, paisal af b'pachos me'asar tvachim. In this case, it's going to be a problem even if you have less than 10 tvachim of height, because you automatically have roich of tefach. So you already have one of the requirements that create a problem, and even with only one, it's already puzzle. Now let's go weiter in the Mechaber. Says the Mechaber, Avol, this is on the second line, near the middle of the line, Avol, let's say you don't have a 4-poster bed. Let's tweak the case a little. Let's say you have a bed, okay? Here's your bed. And instead of it being a 4-poster bed where there's a post at each corner, you have one post in the middle at the head of the bed, and you have another post in the middle at the foot of the bed. And on top of those 2 posts, you have a post going the length of the bed. And now you're going to spread a sheet from one side of the bed up to the post, and down from the post to the other side of the bed, making again like a teepee. So you're not going to have a gag roich of tefach over here. Let's see what the Mechaber says. If you have one post coming up the middle of the head of the bed, and on the opposite side of the bed, by the foot of the bed, you have another post coming up the middle of the bed, and now you take klunsais, perish, what are those? Eitzem arukim, a long pole, like the pole of a spear, and you go across from one post to the other post. You go with a pole on top. Mutter lifrei sadin alav. You could spread a sheet over from one side of the bed up to the pole, down to the other side of the bed on a slope. You could do that. V'lishain tachtav, and you could sleep under that. Mishum de'ein lagag rachav tefach lamayla, because the way you constructed this, since the sloped sheets are going up to one pole above the middle of the bed, you're not going to have a gag roich of tefach. So this you could do. However, there's a caveat, says the Mechaber, according to the first opinion that he's going to bring down, as long as you don't have airspace of 10 tfachim beneath this canopy. Now, this Deya Rishona, this first opinion here in the Mechaber, goes very well with the way I explained the previous case to you. In the previous case, we had 4 posts, one at each corner. We spread a sheet on top. We have Roichav Tefach. But we don't have Gavaya Asar Tvachim. In that case, the Mechaber said, I'm sorry, even if it is Gavaya Asar Tvachim, we said, we said even if you don't have Asar Tvachim, it's Asar. Why is it Asar? Because all you need is one requirement to make it problematic. In the first case, you have a post at each corner, a sheet going across the top. You already have Gag Roich of Tefach. So even if you don't have a height of 10 Tfachim, it's already a problem, because you have one requirement. You already have Gag Roich of Tefach. That's enough to make it puzzle. In the second case, you don't have a Gag Roich of Tefach. Therefore, said the Mechaber, he said, that is okay as long as you don't have a height of Asar Tfachim. If you have a height of Asar Tvachim, so again you have one of the requirements. You have a height of Asar Tvachim. Even though you don't have Gag Roich of Tefach, it doesn't matter, it's still a problem. So according to the Deya Rishona, according to the first opinion, the Mechaber, both cases over here are aligned very well. In the first case, by the 4-poster bed, you have Gag Roich of Tefach. It's a problem, even if you don't have a height of Asar Tvachim. In the second case, you don't have a Gag Roich of Tefach. But if you have a height of Asar Tvachim, it's a problem. If you don't have a height of Asar Tvachim, then it's not a problem, because now you don't have either one of the requirements. You don't have Gag Roich of Tefach, and you also don't have a height of Asar Tvachim. Okay, now let's see this spelled out in the Mishnah Berurah. Let's go back to Mishnah Berurah is Cut in Zion, and let's pick up from the second line of the Mishnah Berurah over here. Umashe Kasav Acharkach, the second case that the Chavetz Chaim writes, if you have one pole at the foot of the bed in the middle, one pole at the head of the bed in the middle, a pole going across over the middle of the bed, and then a sloped sheet going from one side of the bed up to the pole, down sloped to the other side. Zeu nikra naklitin. This is the case in the Mishnah in sukkah of naklitin. Now explains the Mechaber, ushloisha dinim yeshkan. Here, between Sif Beis and Sif Gimel, so far, we have discussed 3 different cases. Kila, in Sif Beis, we had the case of the Kila. The Kinoifais, in the beginning of Sif Gimel, we have the 4-poster bed, the Kinoifais. And then in the end of Sif Gimel here, we have the case of the Naklitin. So 3 different cases. Now, the Mishnah Berurah is going to explain to us why these 3 cases have 3 different dinim. Kila, the case of Sif Beis of the Kila is not attached to the bed at all. The Kila is like a temporary little shelter that you erect around an area. It's like the case I gave you of the folding gazebo. You have 4 slender poles, a sheet on top. It's not affixed to a bed. It's something that's made to be put up, taken down, moved around. So therefore, explains the Chavetz Chaim, Kila deloi kivia, the Kila of Sif Beis, which is very, very not kavua, loi mitzara ele bitarte l'reyusa. It doesn't become a problem unless you have both problematic factors. Sheyesh lo gag, you have to have both. You need a gag roichav tefach, v'gavai asara, and you also need that the kila should be sheltering over an airspace that's 10 tefachim high. If you're missing either one, it's not a problem. That's what the Mechaber said in Sif Beis. He said, Im eina gavaya asara tvachim, if the area underneath the kila is not 10 tvachim high, oi she'en legag rochav tefach, or it doesn't have a gag rochav tefach, either way, you're okay if you're underneath the kila. Because for the kila to become a problem, for the kila to be considered an oil chashiv that's mafsik, since it's a temporary structure, it has to have both factors. It has to have the gag rochav tefach, and it has to have the height of asar tvachim. V'kinoifais the kivia. However, the first case of Sif Gimel, the 4-poster bed, which we said is kavua ma'oid, that case, which is very kavua, it's very permanent. Like I said, wherever you move the bed, that canopy comes with it. It's affixed to the bed. Mitzara av she'ena gavaya asara. That's usher, even though you only have one problematic factor. You have that it's a gag roichav tefach, because that sheet is supported by 4 poles on the 4 corners of the bed. It's definitely going to be gag roichav tefach. So, the kinoifais that's kavua ma'oid, that's a problem with only one problematic factor of gag roichav tefach, af she'ena gavaya asara, even though it's not sheltering over an airspace of 10 tefachim. It's still a problem. So that's the first case, the kila. It's temporary. You need both problematic factors. The second case, the kinoifais, it's kavua ma'oid. You only need one. Even if you only have gag roichav tefach, it's already a problem. Kevan shal kol panim yesh lagag, because it does have a roof. It has a gag roichav tefach. Vayin b'prima gadim shemitzadi duhu min HaTorah. Prima gadim holds that the kinoifais, where you only have one problematic factor, is even a problem in daraisa. Not only in darabanan, in daraisa it's a problem. V'naklitin, now we come to the third case. The third case is the naklitin. The naklitin, after like kvia kol kach kinoifais, it's not considered to be as kavua as the kinoifais as the 4-poster bed. The 4-poster bed is considered very kavua. First of all, it's attached to the bed. Second of all, it makes a very, very functional canopy. It makes a canopy over the bed that's essentially the same size as the bed. Because again, the canopy is supported by posts on each corner of the bed. So that's a very, very functional canopy that somebody would leave up all the time. But the naklitin is not nearly as functional. The naklitin is sloped. It comes to a peak. So it loses width right away. So at the surface of the bed, it's the same width of the bed. But as soon as you start going up, it starts losing width. It cuts down on the size of the bed. Therefore, somebody might not even leave it in place all the time. So the naklitin is considered more kavua than the kila of Sif Beis, but it's not as kavua as the kinoifais of the beginning of Sif Gimel. So what din does it get? Do we treat it like a kila and say in order for it to be problem, you need both factors? Or do we treat it like the kinoifais and say in order for it to become a problem, you only need one factor? So let's see what the Mishnah Berurah says. It is more kavua than a kila. Lakach, therefore, the Mechaber tells us, Mitzara gamkein al kol panim midirabanan b'chadol reyusa. It becomes a problem, at least midirabanan, even if you only have one problematic factor. Tahainu kishegavaya masara afal pisha ein lagag. Even if you only have a height of 10 tefachim, even though it comes to to a peak at the top, and you don't have a gag roichav tefach, midarabanan, we're going to say that with only one problematic factor, it's a problem. V'zeu l'der rishayna, that's the opinion of the first opinion in the mechaber. So again, we have the kila, we have the kinoifais, and we have the naklitin. According to the first opinion of the mechaber, with the naklitin, we go l'chumra, and midarabanan, we treat it the same way that we treat the kinoifais. Even though you only have one problematic factor, you have a height of 10 tvachim, but you don't have a gag roichav tefach because it comes to a peak. According to the first shita brought down by the mechaber, we go l'chumra, and we treat that the same way we treat the kinoifais. Even though by the kinoifais also, since you have gag roichav tefach, you have one problematic factor. Even if you don't have a height of 10 tvachim, it's a problem. Over there, it's midaraisa. Over here, by the naklitin, you only have one problematic factor. You have a height of asar tvachim. You don't have a gag roichav tefach. It's a problem midarabanan, but not midaraisa. Now, let's go back to the mechaber for a minute, and let's see the second opinion. The yesh machshirin, there is a differing opinion who says that this is kosher. Afilu b'gevayim asar tvachim. Now you have a deya shniya. You have a second opinion who's more makel, who says that no, by the naklitin, since it's not kavua the way the kinoifais are, you taka need both problems. And since if you don't have both, if you don't have gag roichav tefach, and you also don't have a height of asar tvachim, it's okay. It's okay. No, I'm sorry. You do have a height. I'm sorry. The second opinion is more makel, and he says if you have one factor, if you have gavoya asar tvachim, you have a height of asar tvachim, it's not a problem. In order for it to be a problem, you taka need both, like the kila. You need a gag roichav tefach and a height of asar tvachim, and by naklitin, by the nature of naklitin, you never have gag roichav tefach, so it's not a problem. Now, what is the rationale of the second opinion? So let's finish off the Mishnah Berurah's Katan Zayin. V'dei shniya svira law, this second opinion holds that afilu midarabanan lo yasru kevin she'en lo gag, that even midarabanan you cannot aser the naklitin just based on the fact that it has a height of asar tvachim. Why? Because the oil meshupa lo mikri oil klal. Because this shita holds, the bottom line is you can't aser it just based on a height of asar tvachim. You don't have a gag. It goes back to what we said earlier. If all you have is sloped walls, then you have walls, but you have no gag. So forget the whole talk about one problematic factor, two problematic factors. The Deiri Shaina holds you have a height of asar tvachim, you don't have a gag roichav tefach, you have one problematic factor. You have a height of asar tvachim. And they hold that with one problematic factor, with a height of asar tvachim, we're already going to aser it midrabanan. The Deishniya holds, forget you have one problematic factor. You don't have a gag. When all you have is sloped walls, you don't have a gag. If you don't have a gag, you can't consider it an oil mafsik. Okay, let's do sifches, oiskot and ches in the Mishnah Berurah. So this goes back on the mechaber. The mechaber was talking about the kinoifais, the four-poster bed, and the mechaber told us that this is a problem. Afilu im einam gevayim asara, even if you don't have airspace of 10 tfachim underneath the canopy by the four-poster bed, it's still problematic. And we explained the reason is because you have a gag roichav tefach, and it's kavua ma'oid. That's enough to make a problem. Afilu im einam gevayim asara, hainu min hamita ulamaila. Now we're going to measure the 10 tfachim of airspace, not from the ground beneath the bed. We're going to measure from the surface of the bed to the underside of the canopy. Now, first I'll stop here a second. Just the point over here is, this is different than the kila. By the kila, we measured the 10 tfachim from the ground that the four posts are resting on to the underside of the canopy, not from the surface of the bed. And I explained to you that's because by the kila is not attached to the bed. So it's independent of the bed. We measure the space that the kila is sheltering over. The kila is sheltering over that whole ground space. Happens to be you stuck in a bed. But over here, the canopy is affixed to the bed. So it's a shelter over the bed. So then we measure from the surface of the bed to the underside of the canopy, and you can see this in the words of the Chafetz Chaim, if you want, in Sharet Zion, Ois Katan Yud Aleph. Let's continue Mishnah Berurah Katan Ches. V'hatam shehechmiru bazeh. Why are we being so machmer by the kinoifos to say that even though you don't have airspace of 10 tefachim, it's still problematic just because you have a gag roich of tefach? Why are we being so machmer? Explains the Chafetz Chaim, Mishum dikvi b'chayzik, because it's firmly attached to the bed, k'moishe kasavnu, like we explained earlier in Ois Katan Zayin. V'af agav demita gam kein kavua, even though, let's go back to Sif Aleph. In Sif Aleph, we spoke about somebody who's sleeping under a bed. And we said that in order for that to be a problem, there has to be 10 tefachim of airspace underneath the bed. Now wait a second, why? Why don't we say the same thing that we're saying by the kinoifos? By the kinoifos we say, no, you don't need 10 tefachim. As long as you have a gag rech of tefach, it's okay. Why? Because it's kavua ma'oid. Well, the bed is also kavua ma'oid. A bed is a nice, stable piece of furniture. You sleep under the bed, you seem to be sleeping under something that's kavua. Says the Chafetz Chaim, no. The bottom line is that we cannot consider the oil, the shelter under a bed, to be an oil kavua. You know why? Because it's not even meant to be an oil. It's not the derech to sleep under a bed. And for that reason, says the Chafetz Chaim, unless you have an airspace of 10 tefachim, we're not going to consider that to be an oil mafsik. Another explanation of this that I saw is that no, it's not considered as kavua as the kinoifos. Like I told you already several times in the shir, by the kinoifos, wherever you move the bed, the oil is moving with you. The 4 posts are attached to the bed. So when you move the bed, the kinoifos go with you. That oil goes with you. So that's kavua ma'oid. The oil that's formed underneath a bed, that's not an oil kavua. You move the bed here, you move the bed there, you move the bed here, you move the bed there. So the area that's under it is not kavua. So either way, you have the Chafetz Chaim's explanation over here, is that it's not asuya lakach. It's not meant to be an oil. That already shvachens up our ability to call it an oil, the fact that it wasn't meant to be an oil. So again, in that case, you need tarta l'reyasa. You need to have asar tvachim and gag rechiv tefach. Okay. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. I actually thought that we would do Sif Dalet as well. Wasn't to be. Okay, thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. Schos of limud HaTorah should be banging against Klal Yisrael, the Roran should send Yeshua's refuahs and parnasa to all those in need, and we should be zeichet to see the BS Gold Tzedek b'meher v'yameinu. Amen. Be well.